Hello there, I am Kiyos the Ronin Beatmaker, and welcome to Lounge Ronin, all things, everything. If you're new to the channel, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And on this episode, we're going to discuss the underwater city of Cuba, a new theory, part 2. And with all things, everything, I implore you to please do your own research, as you may be surprised at what you discover about the world and yourself. So without further ado, let's get into it. Hello there, I'm Kios Ronin Beatmaker, and welcome to Ronin Art and Music, home to Ronin Music, Lounge Ronin, all things, everything, the Monday Mindset, Rants, and Ronin Reviews. We strive to make holistic and authentic content that aims to improve your individuality, mental fortitude, and peace of mind. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Stay positive. This article was updated and written February 28th, 2016 by Brandon Yoon. The exceptional Cuba underwater city, prehistoric ramifications of its origins, part 2. Submerged over 700 meters, 2,300 feet underwater, the submerged Cuban city is thought to have been originally built at a higher altitude and subsequently sunk to its present depth through tectonic activity. But this hypothesis has not stood up to scrutiny or the experts. How can the existence of an underwater city at that great a depth be reconciled with well-established consensus that the sea level never dropped so low? At first glance, this seems to be impossible, for the deepest straits that connect the Caribbean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean are far deeper than 120 meters, 395 feet. For instance, the Yucatan Channel, Windward Passage, and the Angeda Passage, separating the Yucatan Peninsula from Cuba, Cuba from Hispaniola, and the Virgin Islands from Angola, have maximum depths of 2,800 to 1,700 to 1,915 meters, respectively 9,186, 5,577, 6,282 feet. Moreover, many of the straits and passages separating the isles of the Lesser Antilles are deeper than 120 meters. Given the fact that the sea level only fell to 120 meters below sea level has been previously mentioned during the entire Pleistocene epoch, let alone during the interval within the Homo sapiens has walked this earth. It seems like an impossibility for the Caribbean basin to have been isolated, as these straits would have been, even during the maximum drawdown of the seas, still been 2,680, 1,580, and 1,795 meters below sea level. Now here we have a map of the Caribbean Sea and basin. And now we have an aerial view of Montserrat in the Caribbean. You can see the topography. It's interesting. According to the proposition we have established, this would have meant that the Caribbean basin could not have been isolated from the Atlantic Ocean, as not all parts of the West Indies landmass would have been above sea level, a necessary condition for the Caribbean basin to have been dry. In spite of this seemingly underwhelming evidence that the Caribbean basin could not have been isolated from the Atlantic Ocean, even during the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, I maintain that it's still possible, and I shall present a scenario in which this is so. Great landmass collapse. Imagine, contrary to the discussion above, that the Caribbean basin was indeed isolated from the Atlantic Ocean, with the West Indies archipelago being a contentious landmass entirely above the maximum sea level that was reached during the Pleistocene epoch. namely 120 meters, 395 feet below the present-day sea level. This would require the Yucatan Channel, Windward Passage, and Angeda Passage, and the many straits separating the Lesser Antilles Islands to all have a maximum depth lying above 120 meters below the present sea level. Before inquiring as to how this could possibly be, let me finish my line of reasoning. And here we have an aerial land view of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. In this scenario, where the Caribbean basin was isolated, it would have necessarily been dry, as has been established earlier. Now imagine that some phenomenon such as an earthquake or erosion caused multiple parts of this contentious landmass to collapse below the sea level. What would be the consequence of such an event? At each point where the collapse occurred, water from the Atlantic Ocean would begin to pour through the basin through these collapse points. Moreover, the force of the flowing water would carve these collapse points to even deeper depths, in turn causing greater volumes of water to flow through, which would then erode these collapse points to even deeper channels, and so on, until finally the Caribbean basin was filled to the level as the Atlantic Ocean, whereupon the inflow would cease. In other words, once the collapse occurred, it would cause a flow of water that would, through the beginning as a trickle, would inevitably become a raging torrent that could not be checked by any force, whether human or divine. I like that last part. As you know, some people suspect that some of these great cataclysms of the past may have been done on purpose. But that's a whole nother conversation. Let's continue. What would be the still depth, the maximum depth at which there is a horizontal communication between the marginal sea basin and its adjacent ocean, of these channels after the Caribbean basin was completely filled to its brim? Some, though which only a small amount of water would flow, would not be very deep, whereas others, though through a great deal of water flowed, would be much deeper, although a precise calculation must entail considering variables such as the erosivity of the material at a particular point where the channels were carved. It seems entirely plausible that the deepest of the channels so carved might end up with still depths, exceeding thousands of meters, whereas when we have a scenario in which the existence of channels with still depths greater than the maximum level to which the sea dropped during the glacial period, such as the Yucatan Channel and Angeda Passage, can nevertheless be reconciled with the isolated and hence dry Caribbean basin during the same epoch. We have an image here of Barbados in the Caribbean. Ancient legends tell the tale. The Taino Indians who have inhabited the Caribbean islands for a millennium tell a story about the origin of the sea. And summarize from their recount, quote, in the beginning of time, before the land was surrounded by sea, in a place called Zuani, South America, there stood four great mountains. One of these mountains was called Boriquin, land of brave men, And in the village of Quebe, on the side of that mountain lived an old man, Yaya, with his wife Ipa, and their only son, Yail. Yael was a skilled hunter. End quote. While Yael was out hunting, a great tempest struck the village and its surrounds, and Yael did not return home. His parents searched for him, but with no avail. To honor their son, Yaya and the Itbil reverently placed Yaya's bow and arrows in a large gourd, and sat down beside his wife and wept with her. One day, while the other boys were in the village playing with the gourd, it fell on the floor and breaks, unleashing a tremendous flood. Quote, water rushed out of the broken gourd. Yaya and Itabil's hut was instantly flooded. A towering wave swept the boys to the edge of the village and left them choking and gasping at the feet of the villagers. The water tasted of salt, and the boys said just like the salt of the tears shed for Yael. but water continued to pour and to gush from the broken gourd like a raging fountain. A torrent raced down the path toward the valley below. It washed out the villagers' field and swept away trees and boulders. Fish of all sizes, colors, shapes, and imagining swarmed out of the gourd and were carried by the current. Large fish, small fish, eels, squids, sharks, jellyfish, and all manner of sea creatures swarmed out of the gourd to fill the salty water with life. The villagers gathered high on the mountain top and watched as the waters rose to cover Zuani. With at last their water stopped rising at their old village, lay deep under the sea. They saw that the mountain was now an island, surrounded by endless life of sea. The villagers dressed themselves festively and celebrated with music and dance. They knew they would never go hungry as long as there were fish in the sea. Yael, the great hunter, had again provided for his village, and that is how the sea began. End quote. That's beautiful. And here we have an image of the massive carved stone face of the Taino god Kohaba. The metaphor of the gourd is beautiful. I really like that, and it actually supports Yoon's speculation. You know, we have the amount of civilizations, ancient, advanced civilizations that have occupied this planet and occupied the various lands of North America, Europe, South America, Asia. We are always dealing with these constant resets. And, I know in the first part I talked about how this researcher speculated that, the city off of Cuba may have been part of the Atlantis empire. Whether that is true or not, we don't really know. But what I like to always bring up the point is that the further back we go in terms of our history and origins, the more questions there are. And many of those questions could be answered, but the information that would answer those questions has been either purposely destroyed, hidden, obfuscated, or downright propagandized to such an extent that we can't really tell what is real and what is not. So when it comes to these types of stories, when I did the the lost continent of I cannot remember this name, but it was in California and in Washington State and Oregon. And there was this continent that was there previously. And there are eyewitness accounts describe this lost continent essentially being destroyed during a great cataclysm. And the survivors were witnessed this cataclysm and were able to pass down the story through generation. You have so many of these stories being told, but mainstream academia will laugh and brush away these anecdotal evidence of those past cataclysmic events because they don't fit the narrative. And that is always something to keep in mind when you do your own research. It's no different than, are you a cultural fit? Okay. Is this history a cultural fit to our agenda? And those are things you got to really look into when you do your own research. Now, let's continue. Ancient civilizations. If the Caribbean basin was indeed a dry basin at one time and it was inhabited, would we employing precise scientific terminology, describe such a basin? Like a basin which is composed of a lower lying land surrounded by higher lands. We would describe it as a concave. But how might a pre-scientific culture like the Taino Indians describe a land that has a concave shape? Perhaps they might use a metaphor, as myths often tend to do, to symbolize the concavity of the basin. And that is true. Like, it frustrates me how we won't look at these metaphors in these stories. And listen, I love this quote from Star Wars. There's always a bit of truth in legends, and I feel that these myths are more truth than metaphors. And why don't we take time to actually break down their metaphor and then apply it to our modern scientific terminology, as he's describing here? A broken gourd. If you've ever seen a gourd, like, it makes sense that it would be in a concave shape. But at the exact same time, people like to dismiss ancient civilizations as being ignorant or dumb because of the way they use metaphors to explain what they're experiencing. And that is a disservice to anthropology, to history, to archaeology, to all of the different sciences that cover this stuff. So it's just frustrating for me sometimes. But let's continue. Indeed, it seems that they have done precisely this, for the Taino Indians describe the land whereupon their ancestors dwelt as a gourd, an object that is almost archetypically concave. Could this be a coincidence? What is more, the myth clearly states that the village where Yael and his family dwelt lay deep under the sea. When the water stopped rising, if the Taino flood myth is equated to the flooding of a once dry Caribbean basin, we clearly have evidence that the original homeland of the Taino Indians was below sea level, for it would not have been prematurely submerged underwater as it's said to have been in the myth, if it were above sea level. Deluge. Now we have an illustration of the deluge. So this is what we're talking about, right? We always talk about the flood story, right? And we always focus on the Christian flood story. The Taino Indians have a flood story. The Hindus have a flood story. For them, you have Moses, which is in Christian mythology, but in Hinduism mythology, his name is Manu. So you have to start asking yourself these questions. Okay, why is it that the Christian story of Moses, of not Moses, of man, who's the guy who did the ark? I can't remember his name. But you have Manu, who is the Hindu version of that story, and Hindu version predates the Christian version. So you have to ask yourself, why is it that these ancient civilizations, before Christianity came into power and into play, were already disproving and fact-checking Christianity and proving that Christianity's timeline is false, manipulated, doctored, and propagandized? You have to ask yourself these questions, whether you are someone who practices that faith or not. Let's continue. Finally, when the Tainos speak of how the sea began, what is the sea that they are referring to? There is only one logical answer: the Caribbean Sea. For the Taino Indians lived for millennia in the Caribbean islands. It would make sense for them to talk of many other sea than the one they lay next to where they lived. So the possibility remains of a Caribbean basin that was once dry and inhabitable, full of cities and a vibrant, flourishing civilization that was swallowed up when the Atlantic Ocean flooded the basin and formed the sea it exists today. And that concludes part 2 of the underwater city of Cuba. And you know what's interesting about what he's saying, right, is you could make the argument, right, that the underwater city there, located off of Cuba, is potentially, it could have been a Taino civilization. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was part of Atlantis. We don't really know. I know he says that the Vatican claims, and that, the Pope went down there to speak with the Castro boys to confirm whether it was Atlantean or not. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know. But what I do believe is that I would not be surprised if that city may have been a Taino city, an advanced civilization that wasn't part of the Atlantean Empire. We tend to forget there are so many ancient civilizations we don't know anything about. Some of them we'll never know because they're lost to history, or the Smithsonian or the Vatican or the federal government or academia will do whatever it is in their power to ensure that we don't know about that. Why? Because it doesn't fit the narrative that they want to use to control us, to control history. These are things that many of us really need to consider in any form of our life, in any capacity, especially during the times that we are living in right now. It's truly fascinating, but it's also scary at the exact same time. How much history is being hidden from us simply because it takes away their power, takes away their control, their manipulation. And that's what we are dealing with. Corruption of our history and the denial of our past and the prevention of a actualized future for humanity. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Lounge Ronin. All things, everything. If you're new to the channel, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. And until next time, stay positive, stay focused, stay true, and much love. Hello there, I'm Kios Ronin Beatmaker, and welcome to Ronin Art and Music, home to Ronin Music, Lounge Ronin, all things, everything, the Monday Mindset Rants, and Ronin Reviews. We strive to make holistic and authentic content that aims to improve your individuality, mental fortitude, and peace of mind. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Stay positive, stay focused, stay true, and much love. Now, back to the show.